So in like what we've talked about in like the last like 30 minutes, you talked a lot about like right versus left and like the particular narrative of the right with crisis and globalization and like closing borders. So what's the motivation behind pushing that narrative for the right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of potential answers to it. So you can look at it through a sociological lens, which is not the lens that I often, come to it from. And there are so many answers to the question of, why we're seeing an increase in kind of nationalism and xenophobia and all those different sorts of things. Um, I think, the thing that I still go to on this is Theodore Adorno's The Authoritarian Personality, which looks at how people in capitalist societies come to develop quite authoritarian personalities and how that influences society. That's a kind of more sociological and psychological explanation. But for me, the thing that I always come back to is looking at it from the perspective of political economy. And I think there's something really important for us to remember here when we're addressing these narratives and these stereotypes, is that often the people who are investing the most in pushing the narratives that immigrants are coming to take your job are the wealthiest and most privileged individuals in society. And it's been, for as long as history as capitalism has existed, the wealthy have had an incentive to ensure that working people are divided amongst themselves. They are divided based on nation, they're divided based on race, by gender, whatever. Because if you had a working class movement that was able to encompass all of those people with an incentive to kind of push back against the dominant economic system and build something new, then obviously that would be a massive threat to the ruling classes. I think a lot of the time, elites are able to play on people's pre-existing kind of intolerances and bigotries and all those different psychological traits that we tend to have and we tend to exhibit that encourage us to kind of split between an in-group and an out-group. Elites are able to use those, particularly during moments of economic crisis, particularly at times when people feel very insecure. So, in the wake of the financial crisis or during this period now, when people are feeling insecure, they're looking around to think, what can explain this? What can explain why I'm not doing as well today as I was yesterday? And it's obviously in the interest of those with the power, so those leading politicians, in the media, business leaders, whoever, to say, oh, the reason that you feel insecure and that your wages are getting lower is not that you live in an inherently exploitative system that pays you better than what you deserve. It's that there are immigrants coming over and taking your job, and the only way to deal with that is to close borders. So for me, those are two different ways of looking at it. I'm not saying that you can reduce people's kind of animosities towards different groups to just economics, because obviously you can't. What I would say is that there is a way of looking at why these intolerances seem to blow up at certain historical periods through a lens that says people feel more insecure, and actually it's in the interest of elites to make them divide each other.
Well, I guess my other question, which is the one that Ralph was talking about, was is there a way for us either as an individual or as like the working class to hack the current system or use it to our benefit? Because it kind of seems like we don't have any power right now, which I'm hopefully is not completely true. So if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think there are definitely ways that we can undermine the existing system just ourselves in our jobs, in our workplaces, and push back against that, and basically exert our own freedom and our own individuality in the face of a system that wants to exploit and oppress us, and those sorts of things. This actually just popped into my head. I haven't kind of prepared an answer to this question. I was just thinking about my friend who wrote a book called Steal as Much as You Can, and she's basically written this really interesting kind of sociological book looking at why it is the kind of duty, almost responsibility of workers who are exploited and overworked and underpaid to steal as much as they can by basically using their time for themselves. So not allowing the encroachment of working hours into their personal lives, slacking on the job. She actually talks a little bit about that, like how going on Twitter and Facebook when you're supposed to be working is like an act of kind of pushing back against the system. But I think that's quite an interesting example of like hacking vulnerabilities in the way that capitalism works or an advantage. I honestly think, though, that longer term, the only way that we can really start to build a movement that is going to be able to change society as a whole is by linking up all the different areas of struggle that exist in society already. So I think the problem that we've had, you know, with the electoral politics of the last 4 or 5 years with Bernie and Corbyn has been that, you know, there's been this really powerful political movement. But usually when you're talking about the socialist movement, you're not just talking about politics, you're all about electoral politics. You're also talking about the labor movement and unions. You're talking about social movements, anti-racist movements, feminist movements, peace movements, all coming together and pushing in the same direction. And I think because of the way that society's become so individualized over the last 40 years, you know, it's all, the onus is all on us as individuals to like compete with each other, get the best grades, you know, take on tons of debt to go to university, and then like have this very individualized experience of exploitation in the workplace where you're not in a union, you don't have time to go and join a social movement, whatever. I think that's meant that these movements just aren't as powerful as they once were. I think the work that we have to do now, actually, if you're thinking about how to rebuild the left after Corbyn and Sanders, is to put our efforts back into those movements. Say, right, how do we organize in our workplaces? How do we, you know, push back against, I don't know, sexism, patriarchy, racism, whatever? How do we come together and organize in our communities, in our workplaces, in our colleges, wherever? And I think that is, in many ways, a really, really powerful weapon against the way that capitalism convinces us that no change is ever possible, that things have to be the way they are, that human beings are selfish, that there's no way we could cooperate to kind of build a better world. Actually participating in a movement is the best way to convince people that isn't true and that we can actually change things.